Hello, everybody. We are doing the video for this week as of, well, I guess right now. So this is basically the video for this week. I wanted to go ahead and get this done. It is a historical anniversary video, given the factor that we are now in August, and it was on this week, well, in this period of days, 75 years ago, that the end of the Second World War was truly coming to light, and we will have at least one more video that will discuss the final official big end of World War II, which will be on September 2nd. So we will have that. That was when Japan surrendered, which was the last remaining Axis power. So for this week's video, we're hitting what happened 75 years ago this week that really brought Japan to surrender, and it's also probably one of the most famous of all events in history. It's also one of the most hotly debated, and it's also one of the most, how would I say this? It's not exactly the brightest chapter in man's history, but it's also a defining scientific achievement as well. But the cost of human life that it took wasn't exactly the greatest either. So it's 75 years ago this week, on this week in August in 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The dropping of these bombs was the first ever use, and to this day the only use, of nuclear weapons in warfare. Other than that, although we have nuclear weapons today, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, none of them have actually been used in a military conflict. They've all just kind of sat there as a big bluff, kind of saying, if you bomb me, I bomb you. It's kind of a deterrent. But anyway, this is the only time that nuclear weapons were ever actually used. And due to the dropping of these bombs, and of course, another third factor, which was the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific theater of World War II, Japan had finally decided it would finally surrender, thus ending the Second World War. So it depends on the point of view that you go by. If you go by the American point of view, it's kind of viewed somewhat positively, that it was a better alternative than what we could have had, which we will discuss what that alternative might have been. But if you go to Japan, it's highly looked upon with scorn, it's highly looked upon with sadness, it's highly looked upon with mourning. It's just, it's victim and perpetrator. But to be fair on the American side, and I myself am an American, so I'm speaking from my point of view, I don't want to sound horrible here, but given the factor of certain ailments, including Pearl Harbor, that happened to the Americans, plus some things that the Japanese did to the Chinese, the rape of Nanking, for one, which they have never apologized for. We will actually discuss a little bit on that topic here at the end about Japan's history of, unlike Germany, who has repeatedly tried to apologize for its actions during World War II, Japan has kind of been very hesitant to do so, and for this reason, I don't exactly have the most favorable view, because in my view, Japan's not living up to its part. Japan's not taking and accepting responsibility for the travesties and for the atrocities that it caused during the war. I'm not saying the United States was innocent. We committed atrocities we probably shouldn't have. But the Japanese were guilty of far more. In some ways, I'm not even going to say that they might have been even equal with the Germans, if not worse. The Germans had a systematic killing system of this particular group, but if you were not one of those group, the Nazi Germans weren't usually so murderous. It was usually if you were Jewish, homosexual, gypsy, something like that, handicapped. In Japan, if you were an Allied soldier, if you were non-Japanese, you were automatically treated as almost like a animal slave, like livestock. You weren't even treated as like a human being. And they had some brutal ways of dealing with that, including just cutting off their heads and severe torture and everything else. We'll get to that at the end, because that might go a little bit. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. We got a little bit to cover. I got a lot of photos today. Because I'm not afraid to show you some of the injuries of some of these people, that, just so you know, when you want to nuke a country, nuclear weapons, if you look at we have photographs of some of the injuries that some of these people sustained from surviving these bombings. They're not pretty. It's not your normal bombing. So the story really goes with even just the race to get an atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, when they were dropped on Japan, had only been in existence for a couple of weeks. It was a brand new weapon and a brand new technology in the world, of course, created by the United States. So you really got to go back here. And what started the race for an atomic bomb? It all started back in the 1930s. Prior to the 1930s, scientists had discovered nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, which could create massive amounts of energy when atoms either fused together or slammed into each other and fused in fusion, or in fission, where you shot an atom at another at such a high speed that literally the atoms started breaking apart and splitting, and then those parts would jet off at a large amount of speed, knock into other atoms, and start bursting and splitting them. And it would be a chain reaction that would result in a massive release of energy, thus a nuclear explosion. Now, nuclear fission is what the atomic bombs were. These were nuclear fission bombs, and where the atom is being split apart. The race really begun, although these processes were discovered way before the 1930s, it wasn't until the 1930s that there was any interest taken into possibly militarizing this process. And this only came to light when there became rumors that Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany was beginning to look into research and plans into developing a nuclear weapon, thus also known as an atomic bomb. Now, this, of course, worried many of the world, because keep in mind that although World War II had not quite broke out yet, people of Europe were not exactly, although they were ignorant to stopping Hitler, they weren't exactly ignorant knowing that he was becoming a rapid threat to peace. And thus they feared if Hitler got an atomic bomb, it would make things a lot worse and harder to deter him. And many of these reports were coming from people that were coming out of Germany due to Hitler's persecution of Jewish citizens in Germany. A lot of them were fleeing elsewhere, including a lot of them to the United States. And among these Jewish refugees were prominent German scientists, such as Albert Einstein, for example. He was actually a Jewish citizen that lived in Germany, and when Hitler came to power, he actually fled over here and immigrated to the United States. That's how he came to be over here. He was born in Germany, but when Hitler came to power, to protect himself, he fled over here. Now, Hitler rapidly was preparing his war machine, thus it was not inconceivable that he would have been trying to research an atomic bomb as well, and this continued throughout the 1930s. Now, once World War II broke out in 1939, Hitler, although he still was having the Nazis commit research to the development of a nuclear weapon, the research development really slowed down because Hitler was largely focused on winning the war without it. He was largely, and given how well Blitzkrieg was going and everything else, Hitler really, at that time, I don't think saw a need for the weapon just yet, not when they were doing so well with just normal, modern, already invented weapons. So it slowed down the German bomb-making research team. Now, in the United States, just the opposite starts happening. The United States has not officially entered the war yet, and it will not do so. World War II broke out on September 1st of 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The United States would not get involved until December 8th of 1941, a day after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, when World War II breaks out, this is prior to even Pearl Harbor happening, many of these American scientists, upon basing their conclusions based upon the rumors that were coming out of Germany from their fellow scientific colleagues and from others, they started pressuring the U.S. government and President Franklin Roosevelt that you need to start an atomic bomb project of your own. The United States needs to be researching this. The United States needs to be the first one to make an atomic weapon. And they keep lobbying President Roosevelt to start an American bomb program. Now, at first, Roosevelt doesn't exactly see a need for it because, the United States is not at war. Now, as the war continues and it becomes increasingly clear that at some point America will have to probably get involved again, Roosevelt, knowing that it would also be a good defense measure should the Axis decide to suddenly launch an attack on America, he decides that, okay, I will do a bomb program. We will go ahead and do one. And in 1940, after getting advice from scientist Albert Einstein, Roosevelt officially creates what becomes known as the Manhattan Project, which was named after one of the headquarters on Manhattan Island in New York. And this is the American Atomic Weapons Program, and it receives government funding in order to operate. The government is funding this for probably taxpayers' dollars. But of course, it's kept top secret. Unless you are a member of this project or the president, you have or the Secretary of War, I think, might have had knowledge. If you weren't one of them, you had absolutely no knowledge of this. And in fact, if you did have knowledge, they would throw your butt in jail, or I'm not even going to say they would probably kill you. It was that top secret. Now, the project was run by the Office of Scientific Research and Development and the War Department and was kept top secret, as we state. In order to construct the bomb, there are multiple facilities that go up across the nation. I mean, there was a facility in almost every single state on the lower 48 United States. There was a facility that was built to be part of this project. Either it was manufacturing bomb components, it was manufacturing materials for them, or it was manufacturing the fuel that would be used in the bomb, such as like uranium or plutonium, for instance. Radioactive elements that would act as a bomb fuel. Over the next few years, the Manhattan Project, attempted to create a bomb that was capable of achieving an atomic bomb status by successfully starting and sustaining a nuclear-fueled explosion or a nuclear release of energy through the process of nuclear fission. They chose fission to do this as it would be an easier gamble to try. And this would simply be the prospect that if we can shoot a bullet of uranium, if we can shoot a bullet of uranium matter at another solid ball of uranium down a long tube in the side of this bomb, when the timer goes, this bullet of uranium will be shot at such a high speed and velocity that when it hits that spear of uranium at the other end, it will be going so fast that it will literally break the atoms and split them apart. And more will split apart, and more and more and more. And then once that's split apart, it's going to start hitting atoms surrounding it that aren't radioactive, such as the air. And it will just cause this massive nuclear explosion. Over the next few years, they try doing this, and they eventually decide the debate was over what fuel to use in this project. And eventually, through trial and error, they decide that there are two elements that they're going to try to use as fuels. One, the naturally occurring uranium-235, and the other, a recently man-made artificial element, plutonium-239. Now, once all the pieces of the bomb were made, they were then sent to a top-secret government research facility or laboratory located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. At Los Alamos, a team of scientists that was being led by a nuclear physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, they constructed the first atomic bomb. Now that they constructed their bomb, they had to test it. Was this bomb going to work? On July 16th of 1945, Oppenheimer's team successfully tested the world's very first atomic bomb/nuclear explosion, and they did this at the site of Alamogordo, New Mexico. With their test bomb was nicknamed Gadget, and the site was called Trinity, but we commonly know it as the Trinity explosion. This bomb, the Gadget bomb, was plutonium-based. It was based on the man-made element. However, even though the bomb has tested successful, there has become a major development in the war that is going to impact whether or not and how this bomb is going to be used. So we are going to look at an image here real quickly. There. Right here, as we just discussed, the Trinity bomb test that was done in Alamogordo, New Mexico. This is a picture of the aftermath of the team, kind of looking at where the bomb had detonated. Before I show this picture, I want to state something. To drop the bomb, when they tested it, it was placed atop a 100-foot steel tower, and it was dropped from that. Keep in mind, this tower was steel, 100 feet high. Here's what's left of the tower. That's all. Of course, this is a team, and you can also look at the desert floor. It is just cracked. It is fried from this blast that occurred there. They're also wearing white overthings on their shoes to try to protect them from radioactive glassy material that was on the ground. And right here, kind of looking at it, this guy, this is Oppenheimer. And then this is the also main military commander that was in charge of the whole project, and that was Leslie Groves. Now, as I mentioned here, there was a small development that occurred in the war. And if you've listened to the video earlier back in May, you probably know what this is. When the Manhattan Project was done, the anticipation, and during the war, the anticipation was that the bomb, when developed, if it was developed, would be used on Nazi Germany. However, Hitler had committed suicide that April, and Germany had surrendered on May 8th. So Germany is out of the war. The Nazis are done. The war in Europe is done and over. So the intended target of the bomb is no longer needed. However, in the Pacific, it's much different. Japan is the only remaining Axis power, and Japan, unlike Germany, is not coming to terms with things. Japan is determined to fight to the death. It's making the United States and the Allies fight for every little inch of ground on any island they try to take. They are literally coercing the entire population to either fight to the death or commit suicide. And this is causing a major problem. Just for example, on the invasions of Hiroshima and Okinawa in the spring of 1945, this happened, I think, in February and late April, early May, respectively. The Allied command had realized that the invasion of the Japanese home islands was likely going to be extremely more ferocious than anything they had seen at any point during the entire war, because at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese were taking the kamikazes and the fight to the death thing as like to the diehard. They were upping their ante and doing any last thing they could to try to prevent the U.S. It was inevitable that the Allies were going to win, but Japan, for some reason, would not accept defeat. It was literally going to fight to the death. And the fear was that when we invade the Japanese home islands, how many millions are going to die, not just on our side, but the Japanese, because they're going to kill themselves. We'll have to fight for every little foot of ground, and we got 4 islands to cover. One of the largest populations on this planet. So there really became a major concern. For the Allied command, at least estimated that when they invaded the planned invasion of Japan in November of 1945, they were anticipating at least over 1 million casualties as a minimum. They did not even want to imagine what it might really become. And there was this question over whether or not should we use the newly developed atomic bomb on Japan, and maybe we can end the war quickly without having to invade the Japanese home islands and cause who knows how many millions of more deaths. So that really became the question. Now, in July, President Harry Truman, who had taken office on April 12th of that year after President Roosevelt had died. Now, Truman was told prior to the Potsdam Conference in Germany in July that the bomb had been successfully tested. He was actually told why he was there. And I also want to keep in mind, the bomb had been so secretive that Truman had not even known anything. He had been vice president since spring of 1945. Since January 1945, when Roosevelt took his 4th term in office, took that. Truman had never been told anything about the atomic bomb or the Manhattan Project at all until the day he was sworn in as president. And then, as soon as he was sworn in as president, they told him about it. Even the vice president wasn't allowed to know about this. It was that top secret. Now, when Truman went to the Potsdam Conference and he's meeting with the Allied leaders, including Winston Churchill, who was about to get voted out of office by the British Parliament elections, and then Joseph Stalin, who I think we all love. Yeah. quotations about around the love word. We don't like that guy, unless you're Russian. Or Putin. Yes, Putin, we know you're watching American TV. Because you spy on everything. In July, at this conference, Truman kind of made the announcement, especially to Stalin, that the United States had just kind of tested an atomic bomb. Stalin acted with mild surprise, but not the big surprise that Truman had truly imagined he would have. And this kind of boggled Truman for a while. He's like, well, why didn't Stalin have this big reaction, only to later find out that there were actually Russian spies in the Manhattan Project who had been telling Stalin every little detail of what was going on, not only so that he was ahead of the United States here and kind of knew what was going on, but also for the fact that they could start trying to construct their own atomic bomb, which the Russians eventually did in 1949, just 4 years after the end of World War II. Until then, the United States had been the only nuclear power in the world. And then once the Soviet Union tested their first bomb, it kind of started and really kicked off the nuclear arms race that became so intertwined with the Cold War. Well, anyway, at the Potsdam Conference, Truman and the other Allied leaders, they issue what becomes known as the Potsdam Declaration. And they issue this to Japan, and it demands that Japan is to immediately and unconditionally surrender. There will be no conditions. Basically, Japan cannot ask for any kind of condition. Like, you can't ask for, say, example, something's got to be left alone. No, you just got to surrender. We won't be accepting conditions. You got to outright just surrender, and we dictate the terms, not you. Well, of course, Japan was not really going to do this, and that was because the Japanese government was largely dominated by the military. It was really not in the hands of not even the emperor himself of Japan really had any kind of authority over the government. It was really in the hands of the military generals and commanders. And the militarist government rejected the declaration. And despite the warning that it gave of, and I quote, prompt and utter destruction if they refused. Now, why was this due? Japan had this sense that the United States was bluffing. The Allies were bluffing. There ain't nothing you can do. That's worse than what we already had. And then we were already bombing the crap out of the Japanese cities. We were firebombing Tokyo. We were bombing the crap out of its cities. We weren't dropping atomic bombs, but we were bombing them pretty good. We were pounding the daylights out of them. And unfortunately, the Japanese just saw that it can't be much worse than what we're going through right now, so we'll slog it out to the death. So Truman, he starts heavily debating over whether or not he should use the bomb. Now, he does face a number of objections to using the bomb, and this comes from both his War Secretary Henry Stimson and from even Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, who was in Europe at that time. And of course, many of the scientists in the Manhattan Project itself also has reservations, because after they had seen the Trinity test, they really couldn't imagine using that on a human population. They had seen the power it had had just in the wilderness with no one really in its direct line of fire, no one in direct danger. They couldn't imagine dropping it on a city. Now, Truman ultimately decided that he was going to use, likely, the bomb. And this mostly also came with insistence from his Secretary of State, James Barnes, who advocated that dropping the bomb would bolster America's post-war power position, as it would be the only nuclear-armed power in the world. On July 25th, there was a list of target cities that was given and approved, and they were issued to the specific command. And at the same time, the United States was transporting the components for the first bomb, which was known as Little Boy, which was uranium-based, and this was being transported to the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands. And components of the Little Boy bomb were actually being transported by the U.S. heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, which, if you know anything, the USS Indianapolis, after dropping off the bomb components at Tinian, it then sailed to meet up with the fleet near the Philippines, and on its way there during the middle of the night, it got torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. It was sunk, and I forget how long it was, 3 days or maybe a week, the survivors, the United States Navy, had no idea that the ship had sunk, and unfortunately, many of them did not die. Only 300 some survived out of 900 initial survivors that actually jumped off the ship. And many of these either went down with the ship, they starved or something like that. But a very common occurrence, many of them were actually attacked and killed by sharks. It was one of the worst recorded shark attacks in history. But anyway, that's a different story. I just thought I'd add that in there. On August 2nd, the components of the second atomic bomb, which is plutonium-based and is named Fat Man, is dropped off as well at Tinian in preparation for a bombing strike. Now, before we go further, I want to picture where our cities are here and a map of what the situation was at that moment in the Pacific. I do want to kind of point that out. So I suppose first we're going to look here at the map of the globe. Wonderful globe, but we haven't seen here in a while. I just want to point out where Hiroshima and Nagasaki are. Now, Japan is made up, you may not know it, it is made up of 4 main islands, the main heartland of Japan. And you have, at the very southernmost part, you have the island of Kyushu. Then you have the small, tiny little island right here of Shikoku. The largest island, and the one that Tokyo is on, and Hiroshima, is called Honshu. This is the main big island. And then up here in the far north, you have Hokkaido. Tokyo is right here. I don't know if you can really see it. I'm going to try to get this close. Tokyo is about right there. It should be a star. Now, Hiroshima is right here at the southernmost part of the island of Honshu. This is Hiroshima. This is the first city to be bombed. And then Nagasaki is located at the southernmost part. Well, not toward the southernmost part, but kind of right here on the island of Kyushu. This was the second city to be bombed. And at the same time, let's get a map. As I mentioned, Japan was losing the war by this point, and the Japanese were unwilling to surrender. There was this samurai mentality that was still in the Japanese people, that to surrender was basically dishonorable. It was not honorable to surrender. It was a dishonor, and thus many of them were it was more honorable to die and fight to the death or commit suicide than surrender. And many of the Japanese took this fanaticism to heart. Thus, even though Japan was losing, these areas in white are what's left in Japan's control by this point in time. The Allies had pushed in. They've taken back most of this big bulge into the Pacific. They've taken back the Philippines. And unfortunately, they have not taken this. But they're about to cut the Japanese off from their oil supplies. And the Russians are starting to get ready to come in here in northern China. Japan's mostly just got its home islands left. Oh, I suppose I'll point that out, too. I mentioned the island of Tinian. This is where the bombers were flying from that brought the bombs. The United States had taken the Mariana Islands the previous year. Tinian is right here. It's a tiny little island right there. Up there, that purple big islands of Japan. These are where the bombs were launched from. And if you actually look, you might have heard of Guam. Guam is just south of that, and that is actually a U.S. territory to this day. So on the early morning of August 6th, the first bomb, Little Boy, is loaded onto a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, and its pilot and its crew under Captain Paul Tibbets. And their target is chosen to be the Japanese city of Hiroshima. This is the first atomic bomb use in warfare. Hiroshima was a manufacturing city at that time. It had population of about 350,000 people, and it was located roughly about 500 miles away from Tokyo, the Japanese capital. At 8:15 that morning, the bomb dropped. It was clear skies, and there were error alarms that went off in Hiroshima, but it was just one bomber, and plus the B-29s were able to fly at such a height that they wouldn't have faced any interference from any Japanese anti-aircraft or even fighter planes. They were flying at such a height that they were beyond the reach of those. So there was a air raid siren that went off, but it was people didn't think nothing of it. They saw one bomber. They like, it ain't like there's a wave. There's just one. There ain't nothing. At 8:15, the bomb was dropped from the hangar doors, from the bomb bay doors, and it roughly, when it was about 2,000 feet above the city, when it had dropped to that point, the timer inside the bomb went off, shot the bullet of uranium right at the other spear, splitting the atoms, starting the chain reaction, and at roughly 2,000 feet above the city, the bomb exploded. The blast was equal to it is estimated between 12 and 15,000 tons of TNT, and it destroyed 5 square miles of the city. And for the first mile, it was just nothing but total destruction. There wasn't nothing left hardly at all. Every building wiped clear, except for a couple standing remnants. And you had about 3 things that happened. You had a flash of light, the initial explosion as the bomb went up. This is what people reported. There was a massive flash of light. Then there was this massive shock wave of air that just went, about knocked you over. And then came the most devastating part, and that was the firestorm. The big cloud of rolling fire that we commonly envision. And of course, that's at the base of the very famous mushroom cloud. After circling for a couple of minutes, documenting the devastation that was being caused and the mushroom cloud that was hanging above the city, the Enola Gay departed and it returned to Tinian. With this first bomb, it is estimated that anywhere between 70,000 and 135,000 people, or roughly 30% of the city's entire population in Hiroshima, were killed by that bomb. One bomb killed 135,000 people, and just like that. Now, Japan's government, upon learning of that bomb, was very slow to accept that there was any kind of major situation. At first, they didn't believe it because the Japanese are fanatical. They don't want to believe there's a bomb. Then they start getting the reports, and then they start hearing that, well, telegraph lines to Hiroshima are cut off. We're not getting no communication from inside the city. No one can get a hold of relatives. Everything's gone silent around that area. And what happens is, eventually, Japan doesn't really get its first official confirmation that there has been some kind of bombing until President Truman announces it roughly 16 hours after it had happened. Point here. We'll wait here a minute. Now, the bombing, after it became known that almost the entire city was wiped out, and that this indeed was apparently a new weapon, it was a new bomb, some of the Japanese leaders in the Japanese war cabinet were convinced we need to surrender. The Americans have a new weapon, and they just dropped one, and it destroyed an entire city. What's going to happen next? Are they going to drop it on Tokyo? Which, they weren't so worried about dropping on Tokyo. The thing was, for the Japanese, the reason they would not surrender was, at the Potsdam Declaration, the United States and the Allies had dictated that Japan had to surrender unconditionally. Well, the Japanese feared that if they surrendered, the emperor would not be allowed to keep his throne. And the emperor was very beloved by the Japanese people. He was thought to be a god by them. And many of the Japanese soldiers in the Banzai charges, Banzai literally means for His Majesty the Emperor. Tennoheika Banzai. And when they would die, screaming this, the Japanese were fanatical. They were loyal and trained almost from birth to be loyal citizens and devout, brave soldiers for the emperor. And it was feared by the Japanese people that if we surrender, the Allies will dethrone the emperor. They won't let him stay on the throne. We'll lose him. And they did not want that. They wanted the emperor on his throne. And the United States and the Allies weren't exactly at that point willing to accept that the emperor needed that, because they believed that the emperor was responsible for just as much as the conflict of the war as his generals and military commanders. So they believed that the emperor needed to be tried for criminal charges and crimes. So there was this big gap between what Japan was willing to accept in what was actually going to happen. And due to this, although some of these Japanese leaders, they do get convinced that they need to surrender, they also have the major problem. The other ones that are in the majority still refuse to, because they still mention that, no, we got to fight. It would be more honorable to die than to surrender. Well, then some of the ones that are suggesting that we surrender, they're saying, what's going to happen if they bomb Tokyo? The emperor lives in Tokyo. The imperial palace is there. What if he's killed? Then what? It'll be no different than surrendering to him. And there really became a debacle in the Japanese war cabinet over whether or not do we need to actually surrender. Do we just need to call this quits? Plus, the Japanese didn't know how many other bombs the United States got. They just dropped one. Was that the only one, or is there more that they have? Ultimately, the Japanese war cabinet decides we're not going to surrender. Even though they got a city destroyed, they still refuse to surrender. Now, due to this, the second bomb, termed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th by the B-29 bomber Boxcar. And this one was actually moved a little bit. Nagasaki had not been the intended target. It was a secondary target. The original target that day had been the Japanese city of Kokura. However, due to a lot of cloud cover, the bomber couldn't really get a good view of where it was dropping the bomb, and they had to abandon the run over Kokura, and instead was directed to try the secondary target of Nagasaki. Now, there was still cloud cover over Nagasaki, but it was bearable enough that they could attempt a bombing, and thus they did. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb was dropped, and it produced a 20,000-ton blast of TNT blast, and it killed roughly estimated between 60 and 80,000 people. A lot less than Hiroshima, but this bomb was based on plutonium, which was measured that the bomb was more powerful. Well, if the bomb was more powerful, why didn't it do more damage, you might ask? Well, this had to do with where Nagasaki was located. Nagasaki is located right within mountain valleys. It's right setting in the middle of a mountain valley. Thus, when the bomb exploded, unlike Hiroshima, which was largely laying on flat land and not in a valley, the bomb had the destruction wave and the shock wave and the firestorm had plenty of area and space to spread out. But due to Nagasaki sitting in a valley, it kind of constrained the devastation into that valley. Thus, it was limited in its effect to about 2.26 square miles, but still, it devastated and destroyed Nagasaki, the heart of it. Also, on that very same day as Nagasaki gets bombed, the Soviet Union officially declares war on Japan, and it starts invading into the Japanese-held Chinese northern province of Manchuria. So now, after Nagasaki, the Japanese war cabinet, they're back in their debating even further. Do we surrender? And they're saying, well, now you got another city that's been bombed. Now they are going to bomb Tokyo almost certainly next. And now the Soviet Union's going at our ass. So we really don't got much of a choice. We probably need to surrender. So there comes this great argument that starts going out that we do need to finally come to terms here. And the cabinet votes at least 3 times and is deadlocked. They have an even number of wanting to surrender and an even number that's not wanting to surrender. Now, as this is happening, they eventually concede that we will be willing to surrender only if the emperor is allowed to keep his throne. Well, when this news reaches the United States, President Truman and his administration, they're not exactly happy to hear this. They scrutinize it very heavily, and they insist that Japan must accept unconditional surrender, and they cannot guarantee the emperor will stay on the throne. They received this on August 10th, the day after, and because of this, preparations are made to drop a third bomb. The United States had quite a few bombs at its disposal right now. It would keep bombing until Japan was bombed into submission. Truman, however, discovered that the third bomb was being readied without his permission. And he gave the order that bomb was not going to be dropped unless he gave the order, or he would court-martial and have those arrested, whoever gave it. Truman's cabinet did respond to Japan on that same day, and they said, you must accept unconditional surrender. We're not taking anything less. From August 10th to the 14th, the United States is basically, and the other allies as well, they're basically awaiting what Japan's response is going to be. And at the same time, there are U.S. generals who are proposing that we drop a third bomb, and they propose bombing Tokyo, the heart of Japan. On August 14th comes the big day. Japan's prime minister, after the war cabinet had voted, I don't know how many times, at least 3, and they could not break the deadlock in the cabinet. The prime minister did something that was very, very rare, and it was very something unheard of doing. Keep in mind, the Japanese emperor, the people loved him, but the Japanese people had never really, they didn't see their emperor. They'd never seen a photograph really of him. They'd never, well, not too many had seen a photograph of him. They kind of had, but not a whole lot had. But one thing they'd never done, they had never heard their emperor speak, ever. Anytime they were told of what the emperor had done, it was in a newspaper or an army general or a politician. It was never from the emperor himself. And it was unheard of to really consult the emperor in such a matter. And on August 14th, the prime minister goes to Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and he asks the emperor to break the deadlock going on in the war cabinet. Hirohito comes to the conclusion that he wants to end the war. He sees that it will cause nothing but further destruction and torment for Japan and its people if it were to continue, and thus he explicitly states that it is his will to end the war and have peace. So on August 14th, he actually made the Japanese emperor, for the first time that the Japanese people could ever remember, heard their emperor's voice as he made a radio broadcast to his nation declaring that his intent to have the nation surrender. Now, there is a small military coup that does try to occur against the emperor, trying to stop the surrender, but it ultimately fails, and many Japanese commanders before August 15th actually commit seppuku, or suicide, the samurai way, putting that sword through you, and write suicide notes apologizing to the emperor for their failure to give him victory in the war. Japan has officially announced that it will surrender on August 14th and /15th of 1945. However, the actual surrender ceremony and the signing of a treaty will not take place until September 2nd, which is why we will have a second video on that day that will cover just the surrender of Japan. So this is what really brought it about, was these bombings. Now, before we go into anything else here, I suppose I want to show our videos. Not videos, but our photos. There's a picture of the Enola Gay and its crew that launched the bomb. Here we have 2 photos. These are you gotta compare them. I'm gonna try to hold them both up. This is a picture of aerial over Hiroshima before the bomb was dropped. This is what the city looked like. The circle is about where the bomb was going to explode. The aim target was this T-shaped bridge right here. This was where the target was. However, the bomb, due to wind, somewhat dropped about right here and exploded. Which today, and we're going to show a photo here at the end, this is where the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park is. That has a building still left there that was left standing, but it's still damaged from the bomb blast. They never repaired it, but they never tore it down as a semblance of what happened. This was Hiroshima before the bomb. Here's it after it went off. There is nothing left. And I mean nothing. It's gone. Let's see what else we have here. I better show this one first. Here we have a picture of Nagasaki before and after. As you can tell, they also got the circle marked out where the bomb hit. This was Nagasaki. We have this scene. Is a picture taken actually by Paul Tibbets, the commander of the main pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped on Hiroshima. This is the aerial photo that he took of the city after the bomb had gone off. I think this is a couple weeks after, though, after Japan had surrendered. See, there were the further away they were from the bomb, there were some buildings that managed to withstand the blast a little bit, and it was helped by many of them had earthquake support designs because Japan's very frequent earthquakes, and they determined that due to this, that contributed as to why some of the buildings actually survived. But if they were closer to ground zero, the only building that was left standing, like right below the bomb, was the one that's still standing today. If it wasn't that building, there wasn't a building left near ground zero at all. Here we have the two pictures of the two mushroom clouds. Here we have, this one was the one of Little Boy, Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. And these were the mushroom clouds. Now, I want to state here, this photo, we thought it was a mushroom cloud for a long time. We thought it was the Hiroshima mushroom cloud, but it later came through analyzation of this photo, and the way the clouds kind of spread out and how high it is. This is actually the firestorm cloud. This is the cloud that's killing everyone. This was the firestorm right down here, blazing through. Now, I have a couple images here of some injuries from people that were in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Now, I do warn you, there is one that's highly disturbing, but I feel, given that most people don't really understand how brutal these weapons were and why we should never use them, I feel that I will show it. I just want to put that there is a viewer discretion on the one. I will tell you before I show it. I will tell you. So if you do not wish to see that one, I suggest you kind of just skip it a little bit. Just skip probably about, I'd say 10 seconds. Skip 10 seconds ahead, and you shouldn't have to really worry about it, or look away. Look away. The first image is not that one. This is image of thermal flash burns on a Japanese man that was in Hiroshima on his legs. Flash burns from the big old flash, and then just before the shockwave, it burned people bad just before the firestorm had even started. And there's a lot gruesome accounts, but none of them that I could really find a photo of, and that's that there were people walking around that literally their skin was hanging off them like rags. They were that burnt, that charred. Ooh. Here we have a picture of a woman that is showing the burns on her back, and it was so hot, the heat was so intense that the burns on her back, it's the pattern of her dress. The pattern of her dress got burned into her back because of the heat from that bomb. This was in Hiroshima as well. And then here, this is the very disturbing photo. I suggest right now either look away, or I suggest that you skip 10 seconds ahead. This is the image of the, this is a child. This is in Nagasaki. This was taken in the weeks after. This is a image of a charred, burnt child, what's left of him anyway, that was taken in Nagasaki. You can't really tell who it was at all. It just looks like a charred husk, but it was a child at one time. Again, I warn you right now, before you see this, either skip ahead 10 seconds or look away, and I'll tell you when it's safe here in a second. This about makes me cringe. Okay, you can look again if you looked away. I didn't want to keep that up there too long, because I really, it creeps me out. Here we have a picture. No, we'll actually do that here in a minute. Here we have a picture of the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, who officially kind of convinced the Japanese people that we are going to surrender. We cannot sustain this anymore. This was him. He was allowed to keep his throne after the war, although he lost a lot of power. Like he kind of sat like Queen Elizabeth II does on Britain's throne right now. He was a monarch, but he really didn't have that much authority, just like they don't now. His grandson is now the emperor. His son actually just abdicated last year. So Hirohito did not die until 1989. He was emperor until 1989. So he was one of the few Japanese wartime leaders to actually remain in power after the war. Then, as I mentioned, there was a building that had remained intact. It was a building that remained intact over the city in Hiroshima that didn't remain intact, but they never tore down the remains and they left it as a peace memorial in the city. It was the only building they didn't tear down and rebuild. And hold on here, I got one little image. I forgot where it was. In color. This is an image of it was the Science and Industrial Hall in Hiroshima. It was blown up. It was the closest. It was the only building left standing, like right where the near the ground zero. It was the only building that was left standing due to the bomb exploding almost virtually above it. Thus, it was kind of spared some of the worst effects that obliterated everything around it. But it did destroy most of it. This was a picture of it in 1945 after the bomb blast. And here is a picture today. If you go to Japan, it is part of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park with its museum and everything. And this has a picture. This is taken from across the river, of course, but you can see they have a picture of what it once was and what it looks like now. This is what it once was. Here's what it is now, what's left in the middle of the modern city. This is the only building that they left. So this building, they've done some things to help it stay stable over the years, but it remains largely untouched since the day the bomb dropped. So this thing has been like this since the atomic bomb dropped on the city, since the atomic bomb destroyed it. It's not really been touched since. This is what the bomb left. Here's a color photo, a little closer up, closer to it. You go to Hiroshima, you can see this for yourself. I actually wouldn't mind seeing it myself. Anyway, that is for all that stuff. Now, as I mentioned, there's been debate to this day of whether or not Truman was justified in dropping the bomb or not, in ordering that the bombs be dropped. And given the factor that the alternative was the death of millions of lives on both the Allied and Japanese sides, I'm almost going to say that it was necessary. Given that the current what could have been done was that we could have sacrificed millions on both sides invading the Japanese home islands. But the Japanese's fanaticism had really brought it about. If they had not been so fanatic, I don't think there would have ever been the possibility that we would have had to even consider dropping that bomb on them. So, in my view, I deem that given the circumstances and given what could have happened, the bombs droppings, although they weren't exactly the best thing that we could have done, they weren't exactly the best. I deem that they were probably better. The choice to drop them wasn't absolutely horrible. I regret that it killed so many as it did, but given the circumstances, it probably was for a little bit for the better. And to this day, Japan has argued and tried to play the victim due to Hiroshima, due to Nagasaki, due to all that. But they kind of forget they committed a lot of atrocities during World War II. They raped Chinese women during the rape of Nanking, killed men, killed children, everything else, beheaded American and British prisoners of war, any Allied prisoner of war. They would behead or use as slave labor. They'd force them in death marches in Korea, in both North and South Korea. Although they're enemies, this is the one thing they both agree on. Korea was a Japanese colony at the time, and both of them really hate the Japanese for the treatment that they had to the Korean people. They weren't allowed to speak Korean. They weren't allowed to know Korean. They had to pay homage to the emperor every day. And on top of all this, many Korean women were taken from their homes and used as comfort women by the Japanese army, basically sex slaves, if you want to put it mildly. Where the Japanese army soldiers would rape them and have nothing else to do with them. It was for their own sexual pleasure. So it was kind of sick. It was really sick. And Japan, on the other hand, it's never really apologized for too many these things. It has apologized for the comfort women, I do know that, but only to South Korea. And it's never really apologized to China for the rape of Nanking, among other atrocities, where the Chinese suffered a lot under the Japanese hands. They suffered the most under the Japanese army. The Chinese suffered the most, and they never apologized for Pearl Harbor or none of that. And although I understand that Japan's one of the United States' big allies and it's one of its biggest trading partners, I hold that somewhat against them, because even Germany, who was guilty of the Holocaust, if you go to Germany today, they constantly are trying to ask other nations to forgive them for what they did in World War II, for what happened. And they're constantly trying to make up and apologize for what happened, while Japan kind of sits there refusing to do anything and just kind of plays that it was the victim because of one little event. Well, one little event that, I hate to say this, but in some ways I almost feel that it justified all the events that you have done and you wouldn't apologize for. So don't play the victim here, because you're guilty of not only just as much, but of worse. So I just want to share that little viewpoint. If you don't believe me, look it up. You'll find plenty of sources on that. So that is this week's video. I just wanted to go ahead and do that since that was coming around. And I do want to get that out of the way. As I mentioned, we will do a separate video for the final surrender of Japan and the end of World War II, which is going to be a big celebration day on September 2nd. I think later in Labor Day weekend, or I think it's before Labor Day weekend. My apologies. So that's what's going to be coming up. Now, next week, I don't think I will have a video, not due to the fact that I don't have no topics, but I will actually be on a vacation, as I mentioned in the last video, starting this Sunday, and I will not be coming back until later in the week. So if I do a video next week, it will be when I get back, so it will be next weekend. I will not guarantee I'm going to do one, but I will look into possibly doing one. I will. Odds are, if I got the time, I will. So don't let that be a hamperment. Be sure to still check next week and make sure if I put one in or not. I may. So that kind of concludes for this video. So if you like any of the videos on the channel, be sure to like them. Be sure to leave a comment in the comment section below. Be also sure to subscribe to the channel if you're liking these videos, because if you're liking them and you keep coming back, why not? There's going to be more that come, and odds are if you're coming back every once in a while and watching them, you're going to probably find another one that you'll watch. So you might as well. And also, as always, any history topics that you have any interest in want to discuss and explain, feel free to put that into the comment section below, or any other means that you can of contacting or reaching me at any point on the channel, through the email, or anything. So that's all for this video. Hopefully everyone continues to have a wonderful rest of their week, as we also remember this horrible, somewhat chapter in history, but it was monumental, and we need to heavily consider it, both with kind of reflections, but with also of what it really brought. It was the dawn of the nuclear age, so just wanted to go ahead and do that. So that is all for this video. Hope everyone has a good rest of their week, and we will maybe see you back here next week. If not, I will definitely be back the week after. So stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you all.